After the US and Israel strikes on Iran in March 2026, a lot of people started searching for the safest countries to relocate to. But a lot of the content on this topic is about things like quality of life, affordability, and nice weather. That's not what this video is about. It's about which countries are genuinely insulated from being pulled into conflicts they have absolutely no stake in, and how you can actually move there. I've taken the Global Peace Index, the most rigorous data driven measure of global safety that currently exists, and run the top 10 countries through a framework covering military bases, neutrality track records, target value, and residency accessibility. I'll give you the exact pathways, the income requirements, and the timelines. And stick around until the end because one of the most popular destinations for people leaving the US has been struck by missiles in the last month, and the reason why changes how you should think about every country on this list. So, a lot of content answering this question about which are the safest countries starts from the wrong place. It starts from where people already like to go, and it works backwards to justify those choices. The Global Peace Index covers 163 countries with 23 indicators across safety, conflict, and militarization, published annually by the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's the most rigorous data-driven measure of global peacefulness that exists. But a GPI ranking alone isn't quite enough because being peaceful in normal times isn't the same as being insulated when things really get serious. And a country can score well because it's well governed or simply because it's too small to be worth attacking. So that's why the GPI is our starting point, not our final answer. On top of that, I've applied an additional framework covering geographic distance from current conflict zones, absence of foreign military bases, historical track record of neutrality, social freedoms, gun crime, and residency accessibility, because a safe country that you can't get into isn't a plan B, but it's just a fantasy. So, before I get to the country list, there's one concept that reframes a lot of this, and it's the reason that some of the most obvious safe country choices on Earth have actually been hit by missiles in the last month. It's not primarily about the distance, it's also about the value of the target. For example, Switzerland in World War II was completely surrounded by access controlled territory, landlocked within the conflict, but it wasn't touched. Not because it was so remote and far away from everything, but because it had nothing to offer an attacker, plus a long and credible track record of staying out of other people's wars. Some viewers, especially from the US, will look at a list that's dominated by European countries and assume that Europe is one undifferentiated risk zone. But actually, it isn't. The variable that determines whether a country gets drawn into a conflict that it has no stake in is target value. That's a combination of military infrastructure on its soil, political alignment with belligerent parties, strategic economic assets like oil, shipping lanes, and critical minerals, and symbolic value as a target. 3 examples here that prove the point. First one is Oman, arguably the most diplomatically sophisticated neutral state in the Middle East. It had good relations with both Iran and the West at the same time, and it hosted the secret back-channel talks that led to the 2015 nuclear deal. It's currently ranked, I think, 38th on the Global Peace Index, and despite all this, it's been struck by Iranian missiles in the current conflict, despite having done everything right. Geographic proximity to conflict combined with regional military infrastructure is a hard disqualifier right now, regardless of how well governed a country is. The next example is Cyprus, an EU member, a peaceful Mediterranean island with a decent GPI ranking, and a popular destination for those who want to relocate. But Cyprus has already been struck by an Iranian drone in the current conflict because the UK maintains 2 sovereign military bases on its soil, used for exactly the kind of regional military operations that are relevant right now. Cyprus didn't choose this conflict, nobody wanted to be part of it, but the infrastructure on Cyprus's soil chose for it. Now, does that mean a country like Cyprus is off the table? Well, that depends entirely on where you're starting from. I made a video recently about Cypriot citizenship, and the response was quite telling. Most of the inquiries for more information came from Ukrainian nationals. For somebody whose home country is going through an active war, having a fast-track route to EU citizenship in a country where the worst-case scenario is an occasional drone strike on a military runway is still an enormous upgrade in safety and optionality. But for someone who's sitting comfortably in the US or the UK or Canada, weighing up their options, that same risk profile looks very different. This is really a personal calculation and nobody can make it for you. The final example here is the UAE and Qatar. Both of them are the ultimate expat safe haven fantasy, right? That life in Dubai, living the good life. However, both have been struck by Iranian missiles and drones in the current conflict. Qatar hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest US military base in the Middle East, and the UAE hosts multiple Western military installations. The internationals living there didn't choose this conflict, but the military infrastructure around them made that choice for them. So the lesson here is simple. Before you look at any country as a place to relocate to, especially for safety reasons, ask not just how peaceful it is, but why anyone would or wouldn't want to attack it. So here are the 10 most peaceful countries on Earth according to the most rigorous data available from the Global Peace Index. Let's run each one through the framework and be honest about who they actually work for. And one note before we get started, for each of these countries, I'm going to give you the honest picture. That's not just how to get in, but what you're actually moving into. Things like housing markets, cost of living, language barriers, and cultural adjustment. These are real factors that don't necessarily show up in a peace index. Let's start with Iceland, which has been the number one most peaceful country on Earth for 17 consecutive years. Iceland has no military, police don't carry firearms, and it has one of the lowest crime rates on Earth. In terms of the data, the case is clear. In practice, though, it depends entirely on your financial situation and your nationality. Cost of living in Iceland is very expensive. It runs 40 to 50% above the Western European average. For example, a one-bedroom apartment in Reykjavik starts at around $1,700 per month at the low end. Food, transport, and dining out are significantly more expensive than anywhere else on this list. And unlike most of Europe, Iceland is genuinely dark and cold for months at a time. Seasonal affective disorder affects a meaningful percentage of people, and that's not something you can really plan around on paper. So getting in, if you're an EU or an EEA citizen or Swiss, then you just move to Iceland, register your domicile, and you're done. If you're from outside the EU or the EEA, there's a remote worker visa for Iceland, but it requires an extremely high threshold of over $8,000 per month in income. It's capped at 180 days for its full duration, and it doesn't lead to any form of long-term residency. Getting a work visa requires your employer to prove that no Icelander could do your job, and Iceland has no golden visa and no passive income route. Really, Iceland is for high earners, specialist professionals, and existing EU or EEA citizens. If you're on a modest income or you need a warm climate, then it's definitely not your answer. Yes, Iceland gives you the strongest peace data on Earth, but it comes at a price that most people can't pay. But the next country scores almost as well, costs significantly less, and has one pathway that could hand you an EU passport without ever setting foot in the country. Let's take a look at that one next. So Ireland has been in the GPI's top 5 pretty consistently. It was neutral in World War II and has never been involved in foreign military conflicts. And it was also one of the first countries to legalize same-sex marriage by popular vote in 2015. It has low gun crime, no compulsory military service, and it's English-speaking. And it's also an EU member, which means having an Irish passport opens the door to the 27 countries of the EU, plus the EEA and Switzerland, and the UK, which is a bonus that no other EU country can offer. So for most people watching this video, Ireland is by far the strongest all-round recommendation. It scores excellently across every criterion in the framework, has a clear tradition of neutrality, and it sits on the western edge of Europe, pointing towards the Atlantic rather than towards the current conflict zones. And here's where it gets interesting. If you're already a UK national, you can move to Ireland with no visa, no residency permit under the common travel area rights. That is by far the most frictionless pathway on this entire list. If you have an Irish grandparent, no matter where you're from, you may be entitled to Irish citizenship and an EU passport without ever living in Ireland. This is one of the most underused pathways in this entire conversation. You might already have the right to an EU passport and not know it, so it's definitely something to look into if you have any Irish heritage. For those from outside the EU, then Ireland offers the employment visa, which you need to be sponsored by an Irish employer, the student visa, and the startup entrepreneur program, which is legitimate, but it's pretty demanding in terms of the business plan and so on. Then there's a passive income route called Stamp Zero, where you'll need to show roughly 50,000 euros a year. But the catch with this one is quite important. The Stamp Zero route doesn't always count towards naturalization. So if Irish citizenship is your long-term goal, I would proceed with caution if you're looking at that route and absolutely talk to an immigration lawyer. Naturalization in Ireland requires 5 years of legal residency on a qualifying route. The honest reality about Ireland, the housing market is very competitive and costs have gone up sharply, especially in Dublin. So it's pretty clear about the legal route to get in, but finding somewhere affordable to live once you're there will require some serious planning. Ireland gives you peace, neutrality, EU access, and English spoken everywhere. But it's not the only English-speaking option, and the next one offers something that Ireland definitely cannot: maximum physical distance from everything that's happening right now. New Zealand is about as far from the Middle East as it's physically possible to get while still remaining in a stable and developed democracy. It has strong and improving performance on the GPI, no history of foreign military aggression, it's clean, it's safe, and it's English speaking, and it has perfect scores on the ongoing conflict domain. But of course, there's a caveat, and that's that the distance cuts both ways. Maintaining ties to Europe or North America from New Zealand is going to be quite the challenge. The cost of living in Auckland is significant, and New Zealand is increasingly being drawn into the broader US-led Pacific security architecture through the Five Eyes cooperation, which is worth keeping an eye on, even if the immediate risk is low. In terms of getting in, the skilled migrant category is well established and points-based. There's also an investor visa for those with significant capital, and retirement options for those with sufficient funds. Naturalization requires a minimum of 5 years residency. So New Zealand could be the answer if you want to get as far as possible from current conflict zones, but not everyone wants to be that far from the rest of the world. And the next two countries sit right in the heart of Europe, and that's where the framework gets really interesting. Next up, Austria, which is constitutionally neutral and has been so since 1955. It's not a NATO member either. On paper, that sounds exactly like what we're looking for. But in practice, Austria is landlocked in Central Europe, surrounded by NATO allies, and closer to the Russia-Ukraine conflict than the Atlantic-facing countries on this list. Yes, the constitutional neutrality is real, but Austria's position means that if European conflict did escalate significantly, geography could end up mattering more than legal status. For non-EU citizens, getting into Austria typically means looking at the red, white, red card for skilled workers or one of the passive income visa options. Naturalization takes a minimum of 10 years, which can be reduced to 6 in certain circumstances. And if you have a specific connection to Austria, like work, family, or language, then you should consider it. But keep in mind that Austria typically doesn't recognize dual citizenship. As a pure conflict insulation destination, it's not particularly a standout. But the next country on this list, tied with Austria at exactly the same GPI score, is the gold standard on the one criterion that matters most. Switzerland is probably the world's gold standard on neutrality. It's more than just a tradition, it's also a constitutional and international legal commitment that's been maintained for centuries. Switzerland hosts the UN, the Red Cross, and the World Health Organization precisely because of its neutral status. And of course, it's not a NATO member either. But one wrinkle worth being honest about is that Switzerland is actually among the world's top weapons exporters per capita. So neutrality in conflict doesn't necessarily mean pacifism in industry. On the neutrality and safety criteria, Switzerland is probably the strongest pick on this entire list. But the problem is when it comes to getting in. For starters, Switzerland is one of the most expensive countries in Europe, except for Iceland, and one of the hardest to access as a non-EU citizen. Non-EU employment is tied to a specific job offer where your employer has to demonstrate need, and the financially independent visa requires proof of very substantial means. There's also no golden visa program. Naturalization in Switzerland takes at least 10 years, with one of the most demanding naturalization processes in Europe. And in some cantons, your local community, like your neighbours, actually have to approve your nationality application. Switzerland proves the framework perfectly. Nobody would really attack it because there's nothing to gain, and there's centuries of precedent against that happening. But the really big question is whether you can afford to live there and whether it's possible to actually get in. The next country on the list is where the data says it's safe, but the framework says something more complicated. Singapore has an extraordinary safety record. It has one of the lowest crime rates in the world, highly efficient governance, and it's strategically located. But in terms of the framework that we discussed, Singapore fails on two very significant criteria. The first one is LGBTQ rights. Same-sex relations were only decriminalized as recently as 2022, and legal protections remain very limited. Also, Singapore is an authoritarian city-state with significant restrictions on free speech and press freedom. And for a lot of viewers, safety means more than just the absence of violence. And those factors are going to be very key. Singapore also sits in what's becoming an increasingly contested part of the world as US and China tensions develop further. Singapore's strategic position in the Strait of Malacca makes it more exposed than its GPI score would suggest. In terms of getting in, that typically means either an employment pass for professionals or the Global Investor Program for high net worth individuals. Permanent residency is possible quite fast after just 2 years. And naturalization is possible, but it's very selective, and Singapore does not recognize dual nationality. So if you're a finance or a tech professional who prioritizes personal safety and efficient infrastructure over civil liberties, Singapore might work for you. But for most of this audience, it's not the right recommendation. It has the safety record, but it doesn't have the freedoms or the long-term installation. But the next country on the list has both of those, along with the most accessible residency pathways of any country we've covered so far, and it's actually where I spend a lot of my time these days. Portugal is one of the biggest climbers on the GPI, moving from 18th position in 2014 to 7th in 2025. It has low crime, low gun violence, strong institutions, and excellent scores in safety and security. But this ranking is only one part of the story. What makes Portugal genuinely compelling here in the current climate is its track record of neutrality. Portugal was pulled into World War I when Germany declared war, after Portugal seized German ships in Lisbon Harbour. In World War II, Portugal maintained genuine neutrality despite extraordinary levels of pressure from both sides. Lisbon, in fact, became one of Europe's last escape routes. It was the embarkation point for hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing Nazi occupation. I chose Portugal deliberately in 2020 for many of these reasons, specifically Madeira. And I want to talk quickly about why that choice matters because it illustrates this framework in miniature. Madeira is a Portuguese Atlantic archipelago. No US military presence, no strategic value, and no reason for anyone to point anything at it. In a geographic sense, it's pointing away from Europe and the Middle East, not towards them. It has exactly the same laws, the same healthcare, the same EU membership as mainland Portugal, but it has that additional layer of geographic insulation. Now let's compare that to the Azores. It's the same country, Portugal, the same ocean, the Atlantic, but a completely different risk profile because of the US military base on Terceira Island. And that distinction is the entire framework basically summed up in one example. So this principle applies more broadly. Within a stable country, an island territory with no military presence adds a meaningful additional layer of insulation, not because of the distance, but because of the target value. The Canary Islands offers the same logic for Spain, and we'll come back to that a bit later. But for most people watching this video, Portugal is probably the strongest practical recommendation on this list. It combines a strong GPI ranking with a genuine neutrality tradition, although it is part of NATO, excellent LGBTQ protections, very low gun crime, a warm climate mostly, relatively affordable cost of living by Western European and US standards, although this is going up in hotspots like Lisbon and Funchal. And it also has some of the most accessible residency pathways for non-EU citizens. The digital nomad or the D8 visa is for remote workers and freelancers with income from outside of Portugal. Then there's the D7 passive income visa if you're living on pension income or other forms of passive income like dividends, rental income, or royalties. Then there's the golden visa, which is investment-based. It doesn't include real estate anymore after the 2023 reforms, but it's still available with a range of other options, mostly starting from 500,000 euros. If you want to naturalize in Portugal, you have to be resident for a minimum of 5 years, which is one of the shorter timelines in Europe. But keep in mind that there are backlogs of 2 years or more at the moment. Plus, there's a proposal on the table in Parliament to lengthen this timeline to 10 years. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but it is being discussed, which can give you some idea of the current political climate. So, Portugal does offer the best combination of safety, accessibility, and quality of life on this list, but there are 3 more countries in the top 10, and the framework filters all of them differently, including one that I'm quite excited about because it might be the most underrated option in this entire video. Denmark and Finland both rank in the top 10 on the Global Peace Index, but the framework that we added filters both of them out. Denmark is a NATO member with a growing US military presence and the steepest militarization increase on the 2025 Global Peace Index, falling from 24th to 59th place in that particular subcategory. When it comes to Finland, it shares a long land border with Russia and it only joined NATO in 2023. So it's one of the alliance's most strategically exposed Eastern members. If you have a specific connection to either country, then of course, consider them on their own merits. But as conflict insulation destinations, neither passes the target value test. There's one more country in the top 10 that the framework treats very differently, and it might change what you think EU residency costs in financial terms. Slovenia is the most underrated pick on this list, in my opinion. It's a small Central European nation, independent since 1991, with no history of foreign military aggression. It's an EU and a NATO member, but it has a very low military profile. The capital is affordable by Western European standards with a genuinely high quality of life. And the accessibility is in fact better than most people realize. There are 3 routes to residency worth knowing about. First off, the self-employed visa requires a minimum of €500 per month in subsistence income, along with valid health insurance. You get an initial 1-year permit that's renewable for 2 years at a time, and after 5 years of continuous residence, you can apply for permanent residency and EU long-term resident status. Your family can join you through family reunification after your first year, and that's actually the case in other EU countries as well, like Portugal, because it's governed by EU law. If you don't want to set up a business, then there's also a passive income route in Slovenia for retirees or people with other independent means who can apply for a residency permit by demonstrating sufficient funds and a genuine intention to live in Slovenia for the long term. It's the same 5-year path to permanent residency, without all the overhead of registering and running a local business. Slovenia also has a digital nomad visa, although it's capped at 1 year, and as far as I know, you can't renew it. So it's not really a pathway to permanent residency. For an EU residency pathway, any of these options are remarkably affordable compared to what other places like Portugal, Spain, or the Netherlands require. And one important thing on citizenship, naturalization in Slovenia takes a minimum of 10 years and generally requires you to renounce your previous citizenship when you naturalize. There's a reciprocity exception for existing EU citizens, but if you're a US or a UK national, then that likely means giving up your original nationality in order to become Slovenian, which most people probably won't want to do. So the realistic goal for most viewers is achieving permanent residency after 5 years, which lets you live in Slovenia indefinitely and travel freely across the EU without the citizenship question ever coming up. The main caveat beyond that is that Slovenia is less internationally connected than the Atlantic-facing countries, but if you're looking for a peaceful, affordable, and quiet European base that doesn't attract that much attention, then Slovenia deserves some serious consideration. So that's all 10. But before we move on, there's one more dimension of safety that doesn't show up in any peace index, but it matters enormously to a significant part of this audience. Before we move on to the honourable mentions, I just want to talk about something that applies to every country we've covered so far. Safety means different things to different people. For a significant chunk of this audience, safety will include legal protection and social acceptance, not just freedom from missiles or being bombed. Ireland, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Portugal all score really well on LGBTQ rights. And the most compelling story here is probably Portugal, which is a deeply Catholic, conservative country that managed to transform itself into one of the most progressive in Europe within a single generation, legalizing same-sex marriage in 2010. And that transformation is the product of the same institutional quality, low corruption, and democratic stability that puts it number 7 on the Global Peace Index. The forces that make a country peaceful tend to make it progressive as well. And there's also the question of gun crime. If you're living in the US and part of your motivation here is the level of gun violence in the US, then every country on this list will represent a dramatic improvement. Iceland, Ireland, New Zealand, Portugal, and Japan, which we'll look at in a minute, have some of the lowest rates of gun deaths per capita in the whole world. So those are the top 10 countries on the Global Peace Index filtered through our full additional framework. But there are 4 more countries outside the list that deserve a bit of honest discussion, starting with one that has a constitutional ban on war itself. Japan has had a pacifist constitution since 1945. By law, it cannot maintain offensive military capacity, and it cannot engage in war as a means of settling international disputes. It also has an extraordinary safety record, almost no gun crime, and one of the lowest violent crime rates in the world. But Japan is quite hard to get into for most people. The language barrier is real, and naturalization can take a long time and does require renunciation of any previous citizenships. But there is one accessible route worth knowing about: teaching English as a foreign language via the JET program or private language schools. If you're a native English speaker from the US, UK, Canada, and so on, with a bachelor's degree and preferably a teaching qualification, you can move to Japan within months. It's not a passive lifestyle move, but for younger viewers who want to get out quickly and are willing to work, it is a realistic pathway to explore further. So Japan does give you safety and pacifism, but it asks a lot in return. The next country actually outranks several of the top 10 in terms of peace, and it costs a fraction of the price, but it does come with one serious caveat. Malaysia, which actually ranks higher than several of the core picks on the GPI. It has genuinely neutral foreign policy, non-aligned tradition, no significant US military presence, and it's pretty far from the Middle East. English is widely spoken, and life is dramatically more affordable than anything in Europe. But I want to be upfront about Malaysia. Its record on LGBTQ rights is very poor. Same-sex relations are currently a criminal offence under both civil and Sharia law, which is a hard disqualifier for part of this audience, and should be a serious consideration for everyone else. If you're still thinking about it, then residency is available through the program called Malaysia, My Second Home, although the financial requirements have increased recently. So definitely check that with up-to-date sources. Malaysia gives you affordability and neutrality, but not the social freedoms that matter to a lot of this audience. So if you want both, the next option brings those two together. So let's talk about Spain. A solid GPI performer with an accessible, non-lucrative visa and a digital nomad visa for both US citizens and Brits and anyone else from outside the EU, along with a strong record on LGBTQ rights. I've talked about the digital nomad visa and getting into Spain in other videos, so I'm not going to repeat that in too much detail here, but what's really relevant for this question of safety is the Canary Islands. It's a Spanish territory, there's no US military presence, warm climate, and geographically pointing away from Europe. So if this makes sense to you, but you prefer Spain over Portugal, then the Canary Islands is an obvious alternative that you should check out and keep in mind. The Canary Islands and Madeira are the strongest options if you want Europe with an extra layer of insulation and safety. But if Europe isn't on your radar at all, then there's one country in the Americas that deserves a mention on this list. Uruguay is outside the top 20 of the GPI, but it is the strongest Latin American option by a significant margin. It's a stable democracy with low corruption by regional standards, no history of cartel activity, and genuinely progressive on LGBTQ rights, legalizing same-sex marriage in 2013. If you're a viewer who can't or doesn't want to move to Europe, then this is one of the best options in the region. Okay, it's not in the same conversation as the top 10 in the GPI when it comes to conflict insulation, but Uruguay is still a legitimate and well-governed choice. So those are the honorable mentions. And now, because I know someone in the comments is going to ask this, there's one more place where you can technically just show up and live, and it's unlike anywhere else on this list. This is the if you really want to get away from it all moment. So finally, for the completists, there's Svalbard, halfway between Norway and the North Pole. And under the 1920 Svalbard Treaty, citizens of 46 countries can move there with no visa required. There's no military presence, no geopolitical significance, and I can't imagine anybody will be bombing Svalbard. But the downside is that it does have a population of just, I think, 2,500, one settlement, polar night for months at a time, no social safety net, and virtually everything is imported. And you're legally required to carry a rifle outside the town boundary because of the polar bears. But technically, yes, Svalbard is an option. So I know a lot of you watching this are feeling a sense of urgency, and after what's happened in the last month, that totally makes sense. But it's also why you need to be strategic rather than overly reactive. I recommend asking 3 questions. First off, consider your nationality and your budget. Those determine which pathways are actually open to you. An existing EU citizen has a completely different set of options to a Brit or an American with $3,000 a month in remote income. Secondly, what does safety mean to you personally? Is it maximum distance from conflict zones? Is it LGBTQ protections? Is it low gun crime? Or maybe it's all of the above? Your answer will change your considerations. And thirdly, how quickly do you need to move? Every pathway on this list will take time, except perhaps for Ireland if you're British. Researching ancestry documentation, making visa applications and residency permit applications, none of this stuff happens overnight. So if you do have the luxury of planning, this video gives you a framework to help you optimize for the best long-term fit in terms of safety. But if speed is your priority and you need somewhere you can land tomorrow, I also made a video covering 10 countries Americans can move to within 24 hours. It's a different question and a different answer, but it might be the right starting point if urgency is your main driver. And I'll link that in the description and at the end of this video. And I've also put together a free comparison guide covering all the countries from this video side by side with their GPI scores, their residency pathways, income requirements, and target value assessments all in one place so you can have it there at a glance. And the link to that is in the description. If this video helped you think more clearly about your relocation options, please feel free to subscribe to the channel and click like on this video. This channel is built around exactly this kind of analysis, data-driven, honest about the trade-offs, and based on actually having done this, not just having researched it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.